Now, all eyes are on the COP28 conference kicking off in Dubai tomorrow. The 13-day summit will be taking place as the world looks to dump fossil fuels for greener alternatives. Joining me now for more detail on the expectations ahead of the conference is Nigel Beck, Head of Sustainable Finance and ESG Advisory at RMB. Thank you so much for your time, Nigel. Now, let's actually start off with what has led us here. Has there been a significant action from the previous summits that is confidence-inducing that this one will actually make a difference, or has it just been talking shop, or a talking shop rather?
It's a good question, and I think when you talk about talking shop, the fact that we've had 28 COPs, I guess, would assume that there's been a lot of talking shop.
Yeah.
I think we have seen a lot more progress over the last few years. I think specifically since kind of the Paris Climate Accord in 2015, there's been a lot more focus on kind of climate finance, climate action, and a lot more kind of senior dignitaries from countries as well as business leaders attending COP. So there's been that. Over the last 2 years, there's been quite a few commitments that have been made. There's been a lot more focus on, for example, adaptation and kind of a loss and damage fund, and perhaps we can touch on that later. And there's been a lot more focus on essentially how do you mobilize climate finance to developing countries. So I think there's progress being made, albeit perhaps a little bit slow.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, as you were talking about the loss and damage fund, let's actually talk about the sticking points that urgently need to be addressed at the summit, maybe that were hanging from the previous summit, particularly around climate finance.
Yeah, so if we start off kind of with the loss and damage fund, that was established coming out of COP27, so last year's COP. Essentially, it was to provide financial assistance to vulnerable and impacted countries. So in other words, countries that are impacted by climate change. In true fashion, with these type of funds, you establish a committee. The committee was had membership from both developed and developing countries, and there were pledges made of around $230 million. Obviously, there's been a bit of progress, but not the progress we would like to have seen. So since the last meeting that they had in October, there's been a lot of debate about, who's going to pay that $230 million, who will oversee the funds, and which are the essentially eligible countries for the proceeds of these funds. So it's stalled a bit, but I think what we're going to see, and we're going to probably see a lot more focus on that at COP. So there'll be a lot of development to say, well, how do we close that loss and damage fund out, and how do we turn it into something that we can actually practically implement? Yeah.
What is interesting about the summit, Nigel, is that it is taking place in Dubai, and that's in the UAE, which is part of oil-producing OPEC. What is this message sending here? Are we going into the lion's den to be eaten, or are we grabbing the bull by the horns to maybe make a difference from where the core problems are?
So, I think there's been a lot of debate about, hosting it in Dubai. Generally, the host country rotates. So, all the signatories would agree on, who's going to host it next. And obviously, in this instance, it was agreed on Dubai. I think, you can have some that view it in the negative light, some viewed in the positive light. I think it's an opportunity to obviously bring those conversations around kind of fossil fuels to the table. You're going to have those large oil producers that are obviously going to be in attendance, and there's going to be an ability to actually engage with them around transition. In other words, how do we transition the fossil fuel sector globally? How can the financial industry support that through kind of climate finance and the like, and transition finance? So I don't see it as a particular problem. I think it actually brings probably one of the key stakeholders to the transition, to the conversation.
Well, of course, we want to know about our own continent. So what is Africa's role at COP28, and particularly on the back of the Nairobi Declaration?
So I think if you look at what's going to take place at this COP, so this is the COP. There's going to be essentially what we call a global stock take. So it's going to be the first time since the Paris Climate Accord in 2015, when each of the countries came up with their nationally determined contributions. So that's exactly, essentially what they're going to contribute from a carbon emission perspective towards this kind of global carbon budget. If you add all of those together, they need to kind of essentially meet about a 2 degrees Celsius, ideally a 1.5 degrees Celsius target. The focus is on, are we meeting those specific targets? And I think there's going to be a push to be more kind of ambitious. What's interesting, as you mentioned, is kind of this Nairobi Declaration. Now, I'm particularly excited by that because for the first time, what we're starting to see is Africa looking at the opportunity. So it's essentially, it's a call to African action. we've all heard the narrative around Africa's going to kind of shoulder this disproportionate burden of kind of climate impacts, the weather patterns, the floods, the droughts. But I think this is the first time that we're talking about opportunity and ambition for us to be part of the global solution to climate change. We've got a young workforce, we've got untapped renewable energy, we've got very, very large natural assets that a lot of the developed world doesn't have, as well as kind of this entrepreneurial spirit. So for me, the declaration of this Nairobi Declaration is seeing a drive towards kind of climate positive investment. So we're starting to say, well, in Africa, there's actually an ability for us to use this as a catalyst for growth. How can we strengthen African collaboration in the climate positive investment space? How do we advance green industrial zones? How do we drive sustainable agriculture so that we can actually be a hub and take advantage of, for example, the climate finance that's going to be directed from developed countries to developing countries, including Africa.
Yeah, really appreciate also that note that you gave us there, that we could use this as a catalyst for growth that is needed a lot on the continent. Well, thank you so much for your time and for your insights today, Nigel. Really appreciate it. That was Nigel Beck, Head of Sustainable Finance and ESG Advisory at RMB.